would like to welcome you in the name of the VIDC to the panel discussion about the boundaries of the world migration control in East Africa. My name is Franz Schmidjell. I have curated this event and I'm working at the VIDC at the Africa desk. I especially would like to welcome our speakers on the panel, Ambassador Sylvia Meier-Kajbic, Angeline Nguedjeu, Farah Abdi, and Annette Weber. Thank you very much for participating and that you came to Vienna. And our speakers will be introduced later on by our great moderator, Madame Marie-Roger Biloa. I would like to thank our partners, the Bruno Kreisky Forum, for the good cooperation, the Austrian Development Agency, ADA, for their financial support of this event, and last but not least, Radio Africa TV. Why we from the VIDC are doing this event, this panel discussion? Well, it's part of a series of debates, of conferences, of panel discussions about the context of migration and development. We have looked into the so-called root causes of migration, especially on the African continent, on West Africa, East Africa. There are so many reasons or motives why migrants start to move, why people start to move. It can be conflicts, political repression, discrimination, or the lack of livelihood where they are staying. And these are reasons which are called more, which belong to the forced migration. Then we have voluntary, so-called voluntary migration, like people prefer to study in another place, or look to a job elsewhere, or they just want to get more international experience. And these are all reasons also to migrate.
It has not left the headlines for at least 2 years. And, filling our heads with pictures, questions, but very few answers. And I remember last year I was in Valletta, while Europeans were discussing the issue again, migrations, and the focus was Africa. And I remember watching TV, but what I saw on the TV set screen were not African migrants, but tens of thousands of people coming from Syria and sometimes from Afghanistan. So it was a very strange situation. But now, as we see, the focus has shifted again since the agreement reached between Germany and Turkey. It has sort of severed the route, and you have far less people coming from that part. Now is Africa again in the focus. And tonight we would like to see what is happening in East Africa. East Africa, we are now looking from Paris, you see Africa mostly from the western part, and migration issue is also looked at from that perspective. So that's very interesting to see that there is a very important place where things are happening in terms of people getting on the move, and this is East Africa. And to speak about it, we have very prominent participants. We have Annette Weber. She's from Berlin. She is doing research on Near and Middle East with a focus on conflict analysis and regional foreign and security policies. The second person I would like to introduce to you is Farah Abdullahi Abdi. Lives in Malta, was born in Somalia, which she left at 16 to head for Europe. And you will tell us about your experience. You are a living example of what is a migrant, at what kind of, I would say, destiny you can go through. And today you are prize winner as the unknown peace worker. You are a blogger, and you've written a book on your experience. And Madame Sylvia Meier-Kajbic, she's a diplomat from Austria. You're not coming from far away. She's head of multilateral development aid at the Foreign Ministry. And she's a previous ambassador, Austrian ambassador in Azerbaijan, but also in Algeria. So you will tell us a little bit more about the Austrian policy. And last not least, Angeline Nguedjeu. Like me, she comes from Cameroon, but right now from Kampala, Uganda, where she's based. She's been working for a long time on issues related to refugees for, I would say, for a church. And she was involved in a UN peace mission in Sudan. And since 2013 has been researching on the situation of migrants in East Africa, especially Eritrea. That's really a very important country we will speak about today. I'm sure many of you don't know much about that place, and you are not alone. When we say East Africa, what is the scope today? There are a couple of countries, and I think the most important one as a country of origin is Eritrea. Can you tell us something about that country where we know that there are 5 million or 6 million people, and since 2004, 1 million have left the country, which is considered an open prison. They just broke out of the prison. So can you tell us something about that country?
Eritrea is the biggest producer of migrants, the biggest exporter of human beings trying to run away to find a better place to live. And a country which only became independent less than 25 years ago, but has already fallen under such a repressive regime. And maybe very few statistics, the major reason actually today why people are leaving, and so young people are leaving, even minors, unaccompanied, is first of all the fact, contrary to what public opinion might say in Austria, perceiving everybody running away to come for a good life, to find a good job, and to have access to better living conditions. Those fleeing from the Horn of Africa, the first reason for going is actually to evade, to escape human rights violations. And we know Eritreans are living by the thousands per week, no matter how difficult it is. And maybe as Abdi will later say in her own story of how she left, they are actually first leaving, runaway, escaping repressive living conditions. And the major one which we know, and I hope the public will know a lot more about it as we discuss in the evening, is the indefinite military service. As you know, in almost all the countries of the world, even in Austria, you have your Wehrdienst, which is limited to a specific period, your social year, where you actually volunteer and serve your country. But in Eritrea, it is by law that every citizen under the age of 50 subscribes to that, and is still the military service doesn't end. The UN commissioned an inquiry on the situation, and it was the final report was submitted this year in June in Geneva, which actually verified there is evidence of gross human rights violation. And Eritrea, as a result, the case was referred to the International Court of Criminal Court in The Hague. So we have, what makes the region really very interesting is to see that, unfortunately, because of the migrant crisis, now two countries whose leaders are under UN sanctions are also actually have been referred to The Hague, Sudan and Eritrea. They've become now negotiation partners of the European Union. That's how desperation can take people to. And I hope that this evening we can talk a lot more about it.
Can you also describe a little bit the daily life in Eritrea? I say so because now we speak very much about refugees and war-torn countries. They mean you are a refugee only when there's war in your country, and some tend to question if you can call Eritreans refugees or are they migrants. So can you tell us something about the daily life?
Yeah, there's a saying which goes that the absence of war doesn't mean there's peace. And unfortunately, if we look at even the way the actual Prime Minister, Isaias Afewerki, came to power, it was under strong negotiation backed and supported by European countries, actually championed by the Netherlands, by Italy, which actually led the country to independence. But unfortunately, all the hope placed in him, which actually helped him to topple the dictatorship back then, have failed, completely failed. Because Eritrea actually, with that extended military draft, and then secondly, no opportunities for the youth because the country is under sanctions. And then 3, you are not even allowed to leave the country. And everybody who tries to leave the country is considered a deserter and actually belongs to jail. So people planning, people are pushed. By the way, the average salary ranges between 50 and 100 euros, where there are actually no commodities which are actually accessible to the majority of the population. You have more than 30% living below the poverty level. So you don't have, before lacking now the access, opportunities for the employment, even for better quality education. Since 2009, let me bring back the point that as the sanctions were imposed, all 8 organizations had to leave the country. So even the little development aid which could come in actually and cover the gap between the government and the private sector is also not existent. And that pushes the people continually into despair. And desperate people are ready to adopt desperate measures. So knowing that if you leave the country, you can't leave the country legally because you will not get permission to leave. And then now you try it illegally, knowing that, but the rich, if you see the numbers leaving the country by the week and the perilous journeys they take through the Sudan, going through Egypt or through Libya, you will see the level of desperation. And with that kind of level of desperation, out of lack of everything, even the way freedom of speech, that is also not granted. That is basic rule number 1. So looking at all that combination of human rights violation of basic needs, the first initial factor getting the people out of the country first is to escape that military service. And as we will see later also during the discussion, even when you've succeeded to leave, you are not free because the government has also infiltrated the diaspora in a way that those who are here, they are really positioned. It starts even with the interpreter services because to register as a refugee to put up your case, you need somebody who will translate. Some of them come and they can only speak Amharic. So you need somebody, or Tigrinya, you need somebody to translate. And even during those translation services, your information are sent back to the government. So the Secret Service has infiltrated even the diaspora in a way that it is also imposed on everybody who has made it outside to pay a 2% of their monthly revenue to the government through the embassy. So it has created a state of fear, which is also perpetrated because high-ranking officials within the government also benefit from that system.
This is a question we are discussing ourselves quite frequently. But what's going on? 1 year ago, there had been a wave of sympathy, of people ready to help people, and now situation is a bit changing. What are the reasons for that? I could imagine that there must be, first of all, ask the media, because I think they are influencing the situation quite.
Oh, the media! We poor media. No,
yeah,
we
please. I love that. No,
we just follow the politics. We see what you're doing, reporting. We are supposed to.
I think that your power is much bigger than that.
Really? So what did the media do to change the mood? Turn around.
We just discussed that in the previous year. That is, for example, if you ask somebody in Austria, refugees, what do you think? Where do they come from? And everybody would tell you, oh, there are many Africans there. And then you have to take into consideration, no, that's not true. I just had a look to get an idea who are the migrant asylum seekers, migrants, refugees here in Austria, and it's quite interesting to see if you take just the asylum seeker from this year. There had been approximately 30,000 applications, and then I thought, I could imagine half of them will be Africans. No, we have exactly. I looked that up. You can also see it in the internet. From Somalia, 1,251, and from Nigeria, 1,200.
The applicants, but
applicants.
Applicants. They're not granted permit.
They are. The process is ongoing.
Yes.
So no decisions yet for these persons. But it's quite interesting to see that we are just talking about a very small group of persons, and the idea you find in Austria is that there are hundreds and thousands of Africans coming, and we can't deal with that anymore. That is not the right perception of it. In Austria, we have to be aware of that and to make sure that it's not going in the wrong direction. And so we have to look for the right tools, how to bring that back to the right way.
What do you mean the right way? That people feel sympathetic again towards migrants and refugees, or what?
No, what I think is that we should have to, it's also how can we, somebody used this word before, tackle the root causes. That means what can we do that people are not forced to leave their country. It's, this is, I think, one of the main tasks policy should take care of. What can we do that people, if they leave, they should do it because they want to leave and not because they are forced.
And also, don't you think, as you mentioned, that you should set the record straight in terms of figures and numbers? Maybe can you tell us, can you remind us of how many migrants and refugees are in the Horn of Africa? I mean, because what people should know is that 86% of the refugees are in the developing countries, you know? And can you tell us something about what are the figures that in the Horn of Africa? I mean, people coming from Sudan, from Somalia, from Eritrea, and how many are there, like in Kenya or in Ethiopia?
One of the peculiarities of the Horn of Africa is that many countries, in that it has a concentration of volatile political context. Countries who are either in war, just out of war, or just at the brink of war. As such, you have the displacement of people, which is very intense. And a study also from the UN from 2014, IOM actually, shows that 50% of all the of the hosting communities, 50% of the countries receiving refugees are actually not far in that same region, and they are the least among the least developed countries in the world. So we look at the cases: Ethiopia, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, no, not Kenya, Uganda. So if you see the influx alone, I mean, we are talking of a tiny part, but which already is hosting almost 10 million refugees. And one thing also I would like us to note here is that we keep talking, so the focus is so much about this very strong south-north migration, but the biggest part of the migration itself is within the southern hemisphere, within the countries. So as displacement, if we look at, you know, just because of the conflict of South Sudan, people now flee into Ethiopia, into Uganda by the tens of thousands per week. And I see Central Europe is complaining about some few thousands of African refugees. I think, talking about the media, it should also be known that if we look at the countries, we want to look at countries actually, as I said, 5 out of 10. And they are not the least, from the index, the World Bank Index, the least developed countries. But they still have those policies. They still have enough capacity to host fellow region, fellow country, fellow people, actually from not far away, who can walk. And also one thing I would like us to note here is that those who's tracking, living somewhere like Somalia or Eritrea all the way to Europe, it demands a lot of money. And given now the level of the standard of living, which is extremely low in those volatile political contexts, not many people can afford to even start such a journey. As such, the population, the influx is a lot more stronger in neighboring countries because people can walk. When they are running away, they can walk. Some walk for a month, through the bush, running from bullets, escaping bullets. So I think one of the issues when we want to talk about the root causes, first of all, understanding the context from which they live will make even your public here know that it's not only about going to get a job or going to get maybe a bit of allowance, refugee allowance per week or per month, however it is done in your respective countries here. But people are running first for life, for safety. And usually most of those countries hosting, it's even from there that from when you reach a host country, or even a transit country, and that's why most of the countries receiving, they always have dual functions. They are either, some even have triple functions. They are either also exporting the refugees, hosting the ones on transit, or even destination countries, because some on their ways, while they are running away, they get stuck, and they find no other way to live. So they are in limbo, they have no legal status, they can't even apply for a legal status, and I think it's quite deplorable, to see how the debate is so hyperbole, so really taken to the high, and it's a great buzz to see this danger from Africa, coming to fill in Europe. How many are they? Yeah, I think also a look into some of the refugee camps in the region will give a better understanding that the much bigger problem is in the south.
Okay, we will get back to this. Now, Farah, the youngest. So we are very glad to have you here because we are discussing about migrants, and you are one migrant. And you have a very special story. I don't want to tell it at your place. So, as I mentioned, you were born in Somalia, you left the country when you were 16 to go to Europe, but you didn't go straight to Europe. There were many stops, many stations, many, I would say, experiences, some of them very dramatic, very painful. Now you are still a very lively, very positive person. Can you tell us how did you get through this time? And second question, when you look at the squabbling about migrants and the way Europeans react to that, what does it inspire to you? So first we want to know more about you.
It's on.
It's okay.
Thank you very much to VIDC for inviting me, and thank you for having me on the panel. I'll try to answer the two questions in a precise manner. As you mentioned, I left Kenya because I was born in Somalia, but my family moved to Kenya when I was 3 years old.
Oh, okay.
And I grew up in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. That's where I went to school. That's where I was educated together with my younger brother. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a very middle-class neighborhood and a very middle-class family, went to some of the best schools in Kenya. But then when I was 5 years old, I discovered I was different.
You decided, or you
I
felt
discovered.
You discovered, okay.
During recess breaks, I would play with girls instead of boys, and then the teacher called my mom to bring it up, and my mom brought it up to me, and that's the first time I knew it was a problem. And basically I grew up in a very boxed up environment whereby I knew it was a problem. I couldn't even share my feelings with the closest person to me, who was my mom. And I basically had to live in fear and go back into myself. But then I was fed up of living such a life, because I wanted to live in my truth and I wanted to live my authentic life. And that's why I decided to live in 2012, not for economic reasons, basically based on my gender identity. And I wanted to go to the free world, to Europe, to where I could be myself, to where I would live my honest truth. But then, coming from a failed state, it's not easy for us to get visas to come to Europe. So I had to undergo a very difficult journey to be able to access protection. And this is a question that I had to grapple with growing up and even undertaking the journey. I come from a failed state. Am I a failed individual because I come from a failed state? What's the difference between me and the other youngster from Austria, from Australia, from Canada? And it's a question that I always asked myself. And in very difficult journey, 9 months.
But you had which nationality? Kenyan?
No, Somali.
Oh, Somali.
Yes.
Okay.
Through all those years, we were refugees in Kenya, but you never get citizenship because of the Kenyan laws.
Yes, something we should know too. People are not aware of that.
So you are a refugee for the rest of your life. And I was fed up of that as well. But it was a very difficult journey. 9 months from Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, North Sudan, the Sahara Desert. And finally, I made it to Libya, where I was stuck for 7 months of the 9 months, trying to cross and then being caught, taken back to detention, paying or escaping. And then it was a cycle that I underwent for 7 months. And then I finally arrived in Malta in November 2012, where I was detained again. In an EU country where laws are supposed to be respected and international law is supposed to be upheld, whereby a refugee has the right under the Geneva Convention of 1951, which was very much a European process at the time after the Second World War, and a refugee has the right to arrive in any country and apply for asylum. But then we were imprisoned, and we applied for protection in prison, something that the European Human Rights Court has found illegal, happening in an EU country. And then basically that's when the reality hit me that, okay, I was now in a place whereby my gender identity was going to be accepted, but I would face racism and discrimination and xenophobia on a daily basis. And when I was leaving Kenya, my dream was to go to Sweden, because I've always had this dream of getting married to a blonde-haired guy with blue eyes. And I was like, but when I came to Malta, I was detained, and then I found out about the Dublin regulation, and I had friends who had gone to Sweden from Malta or to Austria or to all of these other European countries, and then 1 year, 2 years later, they were picked up by police like a bag of rotten potato and dropped at Malta airport with nothing. And I was like, okay, I left my home, I left my mom, I left my loved ones because I wanted to live my authentic self. Do I want to find myself in this sad, pathetic statistic whereby I am considered a burden, I'm considered disgusting, I'm considered something that states can just throw around from one place to the other? And I was like, listen, I'm not going to get caught up in this disgusting statistic. And I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, girl, you better wake up and start working and branding yourself. It's very unfortunate that we have to look at ourselves as brands, but that's what Europe and the world wants us to do. And I was like, okay, I'm going to play their game. I'm very talented in writing. I've been writing since I was 7 years old. It was the platform that I used to vent and to explore my emotions. And I was like, okay, I'm going to use my writing. I'm going to create a name for myself. And then 4 years or a few years down the line, once I'm very successful, I can move to any country and show them what I've done, my track record, and be like, okay, this is my track record. And this country is not willing to work with me to be very successful. What are you willing to do for me? So that changes the bargaining chip. And that's how my blogging started. And I got a blog with one of the largest newspapers in Malta, and my blog was very much criticized by the locals. Oh, now you're giving the refugees a platform to work for for the largest newspaper. Well, we have a lot of Maltese students who are from university and are jobless. And I was like, yes, I'm grabbing that, and please watch the list. This is the first thing that I'm doing. And then 4 years down the line, I have traveled the world. I have spoken at the European Commission, the European Council, the Council of Europe, the United Nations in New York and in Geneva. I was awarded the Queen's Young Leaders in London by the Queen of England this year for my humanitarian work. I have written a book that has launched in 11 countries and done so much amazing stuff just to prove to Europeans, and that is what I tell refugees on a daily basis, that Europeans are very, very busy being Europeans. So until you wake up and you start branding yourself, and you start, when a refugee woman comes to me crying because she has been discriminated against, I'm like, girl, what are you good at? Tailoring? Please start making dresses so that you become a famous designer and countries will want you. And it's very sad that we have to turn again ourselves into brands, but that is what countries have forced us to do. And today I am no longer the silent voice. I am empowered, I am working, I'm taking care of myself, I'm taking care of my community. Refugees in Malta are doing amazing things. I have traveled all over the world, and I'm very much blessed even to have my book being reviewed by the Huffington Post, by the New Internationalist, by the New York Times. And I'm like, now I have the power to decide and to take back my destiny into my own hands. And it's a very sad statistic that countries have positive images of what refugees can do, but yet even in Austria, I would never in a gazillion years come to Austria with all its disgusting policies when it comes to migration and the far right that it's taking. And it has Weris Dirie, one of the most beautiful Somali supermodels that has ever existed, on the cover of Vogue and stuff, who is Somali Austrian. So we have that image, but then Austria still decides to take this disgusting course when it comes to migration and the far right. And the first time that I ever came to Austria was in June of this year, and I met with some Somali refugees here who are living deplorably. Somebody has been here for 15 years, the children have Austrian citizenship, and he was basically told, go back to your country. So that is what I tell refugees, please work very hard. I'm moving now from Malta to Iceland in November, because I'm like, girl, it's time to go, it's a cycle, and I love proving Europeans and even my Somali community and even the transphobes and the homophobes. I love proving them wrong. I've been trying to meet, for example, a very good story. I was trying to meet the Maltese Prime Minister for 3 years. My blog is very successful on the island, and he basically didn't want to meet to discuss his stand on migration. And this year I was speaking, in May I was speaking at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in Turkey. The G8 leaders were in the audience, and Ban Ki-moon, and I was opening the conference, and I didn't know that the less than smart man, because I refused to use a beautiful word like stupid on him. He was in the audience, and he told his secretary, go and grab her after I finished my speech. And he was like, oh, when you go back to and then I said, she was like, oh, Farah, the Prime Minister wants to speak. Which Prime Minister? The Maltese Prime Minister. And then I was like, okay, he wants to speak to me today because I'm in front of the world stage, criticizing his stupid policies. Let me go and entertain his foolishness in my Kardashian collection dress. At least I'll just give him 5 minutes of my time, waste it. And then I went, and he was like, when you go back to Malta, can you please come and speak to us? And I was like, excuse me, sir, I am moving to Iceland, so whatever you have to say it to the other refugees. Like, I have nothing to say to you. And that is what all refugees should do, even in Austria. Please brand yourself and start moving. If Austria is not ready to work with you and to give you the bargaining chip, start packing and show up in fabulous clothes. That's what I'm doing in Iceland this November. Versace all the way. Show up and tell them, listen, I am here. What are you going to do for me? Please, moving on.
So this is very interesting, but just let me ask you a question before you answer the other one. Are you aware that when you are leaving your country to go and settle into another country without money, actually, if you're not Rockefeller or somebody like that, you are a regular person, are you aware of the fact that it's always difficult to settle in a new country, and that I guess an Austrian going to, a regular Austrian going to Australia or to China would have difficulties coping with the situation? My question is, do you accept the fact that moving to other countries, being a migrant, leaving everything to go to places, has let's say, a particular, a typical, an inherent difficulty, and that it's not maybe only European doing that. When you go to other countries, like being an African going to another country in Africa, just being a migrant is an issue. Do you agree to that?
Of course.
Yeah.
When I arrived in Malta, I left, and that's why I don't like the economic migration labeling that's just automatically put on refugees by the far right in Europe, that they're coming to take our jobs, that they're coming to take our houses, that they're coming to take our country. When I was leaving Kenya, I grew up in a very middle-class family. I never lacked for anything. And I left all of that to pursue my happiness and to pursue my freedoms. And then when I showed up in Malta, I didn't even have shoes. Literally, I didn't have shoes. I was walking around without shoes for 5 days. And I've worked every single job in the world to be able to provide for myself so that I'm not labeled a burden. And that's what angers me even more sometimes when I'm speaking in advocacy settings, because I've paid taxes from the first day I arrived there. I've worked my way to the top. I paid for everything, but we are still labeled and maybe I'm different because I'm a huge believer in dreams. Like, nobody is going to tell me what to be and what not to be. That's how my mom brought me up. And that's maybe why I am successful, because I refuse to fit into a box, whether economically, whether physically, whether gender-wise. It's difficult. Even moving to Iceland, I'm leaving everything that I've built in Malta for the last 4 years because of racism, because of xenophobia. I refuse to find myself in a society whereby I've left because of transphobia, and now I'm in a society which is very racist and xenophobic. And I'm leaving. I am saying, like, Versace and that stuff, yes, because I've worked very hard over the last 4 years, but it's still moving, it's still living, I'm still a migrant.
Do you think there are countries which are less xenophobic in the world? I don't know, some dreamland somewhere? A dreamland?
There is no dreamland, but for example, let me tell you why I came to an Icelandic conclusion. Mm-hmm. This is a country of 300,000 people, and last year 50,000 people signed a petition urging their government to bring in more refugees. This is a country with the first lesbian prime minister in 2009 in the world. So it's a country, I want to be in a country whereby I am going to be judged by the contents of my character, but not who I am. And that's what they did in their 2009 elections. They were like, we don't care who you sleep with at the end of the night. What are you doing for us as Icelanders? And that is where I want to find myself. Not in Austria, whereby you are judged by your skin color. Not in Malta, whereby you are judged by your skin color and your immigration background. I want to find myself in a situation whereby I'm going to be judged. And Iceland, for example, that's a good example.
Okay, that's a point. And now, what's your nationality right now? Do you have
I'm still a refugee, and that's something else. Even in Malta, like refugees will never means never. My book is called Never Arrive. Refugees in Malta will never become citizens, never. And I don't want to be 70-year-old still going through the foolishness of going through immigration. And I had an experience in Copenhagen in this year. I was flying in from Istanbul to Copenhagen, and I have European residency. And then when I showed up at the immigration desk, this blonde-haired, blue-eyed lady, clearly very backward in terms of her thinking of refugees, she was like, where are you coming from, madam? I said, Istanbul. Originally Malta. I have my residence card. What are you coming to do in Copenhagen? And then she asked me 25 stupid questions while other people were just passing through. And then by the time I entertained her nonsense and answered all the questions like rightfully, so that I don't, because they end up pressing your buttons so that once you explode, you look like the angry black woman who has caused chaos at the airport. And at the end of the situation, I was like, bye, Felicia. And clearly white, she was like, what is Felicia? She said, my name is not Felicia. And then I said, I know, dearie. Felicia means the B word. So bye, B. And by the time she was picking up her jaw from the ground, I was already out of the terminal.
That's very provocative.
Please.
Just a question too, because the subject is about migrants going to Europe and etc. In your case, as a transgender, even though you went through all kind of difficulties and predicaments, don't you consider it's still better to be in Europe than, I'd say, in Kenya or Uganda?
I do, and trust me, I don't take my blessings for granted. For example, in Malta has one of the best gender identity laws in the world. You can just change your gender identity on your passport based on self-determination, and that's something that Austria even doesn't have. And I don't take my blessings for granted. But at the end of the day, there's something called intersectionality, and intersectionality means different identities within one identity. So, for example, there's this paragraph on my book whereby I explain about that question, and it goes deeper into intersectionality. And the paragraph reads, right, it is very shortly. I have been told many times by family, friends, colleagues, and strangers that I, a black African Muslim refugee trans woman, that I'm outside the norms accepted by society, that my dreams are a reflection of my upbringing in a dissident, immoral society that has corrupted who I really am. But who am I really? Am I allowed to speak for myself, or must my desires form the battleground for causes I don't care about? My answer to that is very, very simple. No one, and I repeat, no one, should presume to have the authority to allow anyone anything. By reflecting on this notion, I discovered that only I could give myself permission on how to lead my life. Naysayers, be damned. In the end, something gives way. The earth does not move, but something shifts. That shift is change. And what is change precisely? Change, according to me, is the layman's lingo for that elusive state that lovers, dreamers, prophets, and politicians call freedom. So, freedom for me means a package. It doesn't mean one part of the package. So for me to be freely trans in Europe, and I'm basically discriminated against based on my skin color on a daily basis, and for me sometimes racial discrimination on the street is different to structural discrimination, because you can deal with stupidity on the streets, but when you walk into an office and the structures are very racist and built on racism, that's something that I can't take. I'm sorry, but I can't.
So, do you think you are a typical refugee? You are not.
I'm a blessed refugee, because not every refugee gets to meet the Queen. Not every refugee travels the world. I am very blessed, and I'm very aware. Every day when I wake up, and sometimes even in Malta, and today I was having a press junket whereby we were meeting with several, and they ask you, aren't you blessed to be in Europe? And I'm like, no, because I worked for everything. And this is a question that even within my Somali community, they don't like it, because you are supposed to be blessed and humble because you have been handed something, because a woman is supposed to be thankful always for the small things that she has. And I'm like, no, I worked for everything.
And what is your link, what is your relationship to religion? Last question, because we are interested in having a real person, a case study, sort of.
I grew up in Islam. I'm still a Muslim. Dealing with all the emotions, I was very angry at God. I was like, and I've not started even my physical transition. Yes, whenever I go, but if I ever go back to Africa, people are like, she's very beautiful. And then when they found out the trans identity, they're like, Yes. So God is, all of this is God. I've not started my physical transition, and at the end of the day, I was very angry. I was like, you created my like this. You gave me Kardashian calves. I didn't go to the shop and buy them. I don't have millions to buy a butt like Kim. And you gave me one naturally. Why did you create me like this? Why wasn't I just born normal? And I had to go through therapy upon my arrival in Malta and write and self-reflect to understand that God has created me in the most beautiful sense, and people like me, it's just society's interpretation of religion that's based on their norms that has dictated over the years. So now my relationship with the higher being, whatever it is much more settled and beautiful. And I don't care what people say.
My question to you, Annette, is Farah is very special. She's not an economic migrant. She's sort of a refugee because of gender issues, and this is not really dealt with, not being dealt with when we mean that. But, you know, let's say the bulk of it is more economic and sort of refugees. So my question to you is, Annette, is it fair to make that difference, to discriminate between what they call coming from Africa, you know, we had all kinds of situations, to discriminate between sort of economic migrants, which are not entitled to stay in Europe, and other asylum seekers for, you know, for human rights violation, war, and is it, at the end of the day, don't you have people in need and in dire need, and is that fair to do that? Because in reference to history, you remember when Europeans left Europe to settle in America or South Africa or Australia, they were not always driven by war. There was that also, but there were a lot of economic migrants. So why that now people feel that it's fair to discriminate between both?
Well, I'm not really an expert on that field, but I think we've discussed it before. But when you look back, not only on, you know, in the Horn of Africa, on let's say colonial times, but also on globalization. I mean, and Farah said it many times in terms of, you didn't use the word entitlement, but the entitlement that we have in Western societies right now in terms of understanding our own wealth as something that we created and not something that came through, you know, all different parts. Yeah. You know, the resources, the cheap resources we still take from specifically Africa, globalization, where we as Germans are, you know, we are blessed because our exports, you know, are driven on a very easy, smooth way. So I think the question is much more, it's much bigger. Who is to say, you know, that you are a refugee or you are a migrant without asking the bigger question? Do we have fair trade systems? Do we have fair economies? You know, what kind of exploitation is happening not only between the North and the South? And I think this is for me always very important to also, if you look at the governments in the Horn of Africa, it's not just that they are exploited. They are their own agents. They have their own responsibilities. And I think this is also something that we shouldn't forget, that it's not just, you know, us driving this, but also how do we deal with this? How do we deal with their agency? How do we deal with their responsibility? Do we take it, as Angeline was saying, are we serious with our interaction on human rights abuses? Or are we not serious because, you know, our first interest is maybe economy, our first interest is the war on terror, our first interest is to have numbers by the end of the year showing that basically nobody's arriving here. I don't see us developing a more holistic approach on this. And I think what we see, and we've discussed it before in terms of the far right, but I think it's a longer dynamic that we can see in Europe is also the question that we're losing political visions and that we're going back to identity politics in a very brutal way. And I think, you know, we've discussed it also before in terms of what should be the message? Should the message be to support people who are striving for freedom? We don't do that. Why not? I mean, that was part of, you know, the political agenda, the political vision. We gave that up for what? And I think these questions, I don't see that we can discuss refugees or migration or all of this without having a much more critical self-reflection, not only on Europe, but on our particular countries. And I have to say that, you know, I mean, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have to reference our particular countries so much, but choosing to circle around in a very reactive way, to circle around something that the right wing is imposing on us, rather than taking up something that we should actually sell much better. You know, what kind of values do we have? What kind of political vision do we have? What does democracy mean to us?
This migrant crisis, the way they put it, there's no quick fix. And, but what we see, you know, in the long run, only attempts to, you know, to please the crowd, to say we are doing something, those people should go. Why should they go? Why shouldn't we deal with it in another way? Why shouldn't we look at the situation on a longer period and in a strategy encompassing, I don't know, a region, a continent, or whatever, you know, this kind of long-term thinking, and which is not enabled by the way people have to be elected after 4 years or 5 years, you know. I mean, it's a large question, but do you think, without trying to change other systems, but just Europeans, how they deal with a certain number of issues, and specifically migration?
I fully agree with you that migration is nothing you can solve in the short run. It doesn't work. It is a long-term period process, and it's not about pouring money somewhere. That doesn't help. It's the way. It's what do we intend? What are the goals? And the most, and you know.
And what are they? What are the goals they want to achieve? Just tell people to stay at home, or what else?
They should stay if they want to stay. I think that's an important thing, that they have the possibility to decide themselves if do they want to go or do they want to stay.
You know, every normal single human being wants to stay at home when the conditions are, you know, everybody feels better at home, you know. So if you have to decide to leave your country, your environment, your history, it's a very crucial, it's dramatic situations.
So we have to think, I think we have also to rethink a bit our European development policy. A couple of years ago, if you're in the 60s or 70s, when you talk about development cooperation, you talked about how to improve economic growth, how to increase the rate of industrialization. And now we started a complete shift, because now policy, or at least we start to put the human being in the center of the policy. We are still on the way. We are not yet so far to say yes, it works. But putting the human being in the center of the policy means we think about is this person somebody who just gets goodies, or do we support this person as a human being to help him or herself? To this empowerment must be in the center of development policy.
What do you think? Why Europeans are afraid to receive refugees here in Europe?
Because of
misinformation, because of the right wing, which has gained a lot of ground over the last years, because of fear of the unknown. They're afraid of cultures. They're afraid of what's coming. They're afraid of color. They're afraid of refugees in general, and it's a very sad situation, because migration has been with us since forever, and Europeans migrated into Africa and into other countries, colonizing us, and at the end of the day now complaining about migration into Europe, which is very cynical for me. That's not true, because as we spoke about the panel, most of the migration is south to south. It's not south to north. So a lot of Somali refugees are in Kenya, are in Uganda. They're within the continent. They're not coming to Europe. And it's just a minority few that make it to Europe. So at the end of the day, yes, as Africans, we have to look at what we are not doing right. But we also have to acknowledge that we have been dealing with our partners in Europe in a very wrong way since gaining independence, and we have very dehumanizing systems in place even in Africa. Because for LGBTI people to leave Africa to come to Europe for safety, that's a questionable thing to begin with.
The question on what is security in the realm of refugees, definitely, in my understanding, it should be security for refugees, and not security against refugees, or not security keeping refugees away, or any of this. And I think we should actually reformulate, or we should restructure European policies towards this. How can we protect refugees? How can we protect people who are basically running for their lives?
And so what do you think is the conclusion of this event today? So we should deal with it, and how should we deal with this problem?
The conclusion of this evening, I think, is very hard, because we talked about a lot of different issues, but I think for me a couple of themes remain. To understand that the search for freedom, or the understanding that you're pursuing freedom as a goal, I think that should be much more on the agenda. We should realize that much more. The topic that refugees or migration is only one small part of the whole question of globalization, of the whole question of what kind of fair trade agreements do we have, what kind of economies do we have. And I think we cannot just have one part and leave out the other side. To me, also, the question is how are we dealing with issues such as identity or national identity here in Europe, and how much is that connected to the question of refugees?